Good afternoon to all of you. This is Professor Ganesh Sethi, Department of Journalism and Mass Communication. Today, I am going to speak about freedom of press or freedom of speech and expression. Friends, this is one of the important concepts in journalism and mass communication. And this freedom of speech and expression is not only valuable, important for journalism and mass communication, but all the citizens of this country are also enjoying this freedom of speech and expression as guaranteed by our Indian Constitution. Friends, when you talk about freedom of press, so there are a number of scientists, experts in this journalism field. They have coined in a different manner or differently. Friends, some authors, some experts in this field, they have rightly argued that freedom of press is the watchdog of the society, or media is the social educator, social motivator, and it is one of the important entity of any democratic form of government. Free and fair press is at most important to run the democracy in a very smooth manner. Because when you talk about democracy, democracy is nothing but it is of the people, for the people, and by the people. So when we come together, the entire thing based on the people, and if the people are not informed properly, if the people are not conveyed the message, if the people are not enjoying the freedom to speak, then the democratic values will go down like anything. So to run the democratic form of government or any form of government, press, and that too enjoying the freedom of the press, is at most important. Friends, there are so many things to go to speak about the freedom of speech and expression, but like other concept, first of all, we have to see the evolution, the existence, the historical development, the historical growth of the concept of freedom of speech and expression. Friends, coming to the evolution of the concept, it is clearly mentioned here that because for any word, it is not came into existence instantly, but it's a slow and steady, steadily developed the concept of freedom of speech and expression, and it became inevitable to almost all the countries, to almost all the governments. So if we talk about the evolution of the concept of the freedom of speech and expression, some people have rightly argued that freedom of speech and expression is a natural right which a human being acquires by birth. So it is clearly giving us a clear impression about that freedom of speech and expression is nothing but it is a natural right. Friends, what exactly do you mean by natural right? Natural right means the rights which acquired by the human beings by its birth. For example, there are so many rights we are enjoying our right by birth, like free to move somewhere, free to have our occupation, free to have our own education, free to choose any kind of profession, occupation. That is also to some extent considered as a natural right. Similarly, freedom of speech and expression also considered as a natural right, and almost all the individuals, citizens, they acquire this right by birth. Once you took your birth, then it will come automatically to your body and mind that you should enjoy this freedom of speech and expression, and it is a natural right. And some other people have also rightly argued that it is a mother of all liberty. It is mother of all liberty in the sense whatever liberty, whatever freedom, whatever independence we are getting now by the constitution, by the government, or by the political parties, naturally the freedom of speech and expression is considered as the mother of all liberty. Why it is considered as the mother of all liberty? The reason is that when we are allowed to speak freely, when we are allowed to disseminate information, to impart information, free for circulation of information, and if we are not allowed to open our mouth, then it is all the other liberties are having little value. So if somebody is having full independence and full freedom to speak freely, means naturally it will come from our mouth, and we are enjoying like anything, and we are enjoying like a huge right which will give about from our mouth, and there will be no restriction to speak, means naturally the first foremost important liberty is the freedom of speech. We have to allow speak freely, and we should enjoy like anything to speak freely, to have to express our opinions, thought, and speech freely. Then only it will be considered as we are enjoying a full liberty. So that's why some people have argued that it is a mother of all liberty, and through speech and expression a human being convey his thoughts, sentiments, and feelings to others. Why it is considered in another hand, it is considered as that through speech means where the human beings, they express freely and convey his thoughts, sentiments, and feelings to others. What exactly I am thinking, what exactly sentiments I have to convey, I have to disseminate, I have to inform to others. That means that kind of independence, that kind of freedom, that kind of liberty, if I am able to acquire, if I am able to enjoy, then it should be considered. That's why it is considered as a mother of or liberty. So the first one is that it is the natural right where the human beings acquire by birth, and second, some people have argued that it is a mother of all liberty because through this liberty we are able to share or convey our thought, opinion, belief, and feelings to others. That's why it is considered as a mother of all liberty. And the third important point here I am going to discuss that to express freely without restriction came to be known as a freedom of speech and expression. So here the cream point, the epicenter of freedom of speech and expression is that when we speak freely, when we share our information freely, when we share our thought and whatever we are willing to express freely without having any restriction from the government, from the law agency, from any other party, that is all talking about the freedom of speech and expression. It means the state should not have any kind of restriction on freedom of speech and expression. Of course, there are some other criteria which I am going to discuss in later part, but when we talk about what is freedom of speech and expression, when an individual, when a citizen is going to speak freely without having any hindrance, without having any obstacle, without having any restriction by the state, then it is considered as the freedom of speech and expression. It means the state have nothing to put any kind of restriction for the citizens, for the individuals to speak freely, to share information, to freedom to publication, freedom to circulation, then it is considered as a freedom of speech and expression. The concept of freedom of speech and expression is borrowed from the American Constitution. Friends, when we framed our Constitution, when we draw our Constitution, and when our forefathers decided to have our Indian Constitution, at that time they have borrowed different salient features from different constitutions from foreign countries. So similarly, the freedom of speech and expression also borrowed from American Constitution. And like other salient features like a parliamentary form of government, we have borrowed from the Great Britain. And if we are talking about the presidential form of government, we have borrowed from the USA Constitution. If we are talking about the fundamental rights of our Constitution, certainly we have borrowed from the American Constitution. Similarly, these salient features of our Indian Constitution and this fundamental right we have borrowed from the American Constitution, because American Constitution is a constitution where most of the countries, they have borrowed different salient features for their own constitution, because it gives a clear-cut picture, it gives a very good idea about your constitution. That's why similarly our Indian Constitution have borrowed this salient feature of fundamental rights, and that is freedom of speech and expression we have borrowed from the American Constitution. The law of sedition of 1817 also contributed to the evolution of freedom of speech and expression. So some people or some authors have rightly argued that when we talk about the evolution of the concept of freedom of speech and expression, no doubt we have borrowed the provision of fundamental rights, that freedom of speech speech and expression from the American Constitution, but at the same time, the law of sedition also to some extent contributed the evolution of freedom of speech and expression. Because when when our forefathers developed the concept in our Constitution, certainly they have taken very seriously and what are the other criteria and what are the other existence truth, so that we can give a clear-cut picture about the evolution of the concept of freedom of speech and expression. To some extent, this law of sedition also directly or indirectly contributed for the evolution of the concept of the freedom of speech and expression. So the freedom of speech and expression is recognized in international and regional human rights. Friends, this is a kind of freedom, this is a kind of independence, this is a kind of, fundamental rights. It is not only recognized by the various constitution by different countries, but it is also recognized, but it is also, given full support by other international agencies or other international organizations also. So because this is not only relating to Indian Constitution, this right, as I told you from the very beginning, this is a natural right. Whoever it takes by birth, it acquires by birth this right this kind of freedom of speech and expression. So whether it is Indian, whether it is American, whether it is a Great Britain people, whoever it may be, they have to have very good independence, speak freely, and to have this freedom of speech and expression. That's why, by considering all these surroundings, the international agencies also have given full recognition to the concept of freedom of speech and expression. It is not only recognized, it is not only positioned by the international agency, international organization, but if you talk about state wise, if you talk about local wise, regional wise also, it has recognized by various agencies, various organizations, various groups, even individuals also, because it is one of the important liberty, it is one of the important right. Almost all the citizens should have to enjoy this freedom of speech and expression. That's why, irrespective of caste, creed, color, irrespective of our power position, designation, every citizen, every individual have to enjoy this freedom of speech and expression, because it is very much essential, it is very much necessary, and it is inevitable to almost all the citizens of this country. So what are the other international agencies, what are the other international organizations which have given full recognition to this freedom of speech and expression? Like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights also recognized, and like our Indian Constitution, they have given a special article to this freedom of speech and expression, Article 19 of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it is a very good document, and is talking about the human rights. And because it is a fundamental right, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights have given a specific space, specific position to have this freedom of speech and expression. That's why they have incorporated in their charter in Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Similarly, the European Convention on Human Rights also given article in their charter. They have mentioned Article 10 is talking about the freedom of speech and expression. The first one is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the second one is the European Convention on Human Rights, and the third one is American Convention on Human Rights. Also Article 13 given a clear-cut space, given a clear position to the freedom of speech and expression. So now we can assess ourselves how much the concept important is and how much relevant is the concept of freedom of speech and expression, because the international agency, almost all the constitution, they have given full space to have a very good space in their constitution about the freedom of speech and expression. And even the African Charter on Human and People's Rights also given this freedom of speech and expression, and Article 9 is clearly talking about African Charter on Human and People's Rights, clearly talking about the freedom of speech and expression. So friends, when we analyze ourselves, but this concept of freedom of speech and expression from Indian context, from the world point of view, naturally almost all the constitution, naturally almost all the international agencies, organizations, they have given a full recognition to this concept of freedom of speech and expression, because as I told you, it is mother of all liberty. It is a fundamental right. Almost all the citizens should enjoy like anything of the concept of freedom of speech and expression. So as in India, the first part of right to freedom under fundamental rights says about the freedom of speech and expression under Article 19(1)(a) of the Indian Constitution. Friends, for every fundamental rights, and particularly in our constitution, we have 6 fundamental rights, and the second important fundamental right to freedom, is the first part of the right to freedom, clearly talking about the freedom of speech and expression. And Article 19(1)(a) of the Indian Constitution clearly enshrined that each and every citizen of this country have to enjoy the right to freedom of speech and expression, and which means right to speak freely, right to move, right to publish freely, right to have circulation freely, and at the same time, if we are sharing our information, if we are sharing our opinion and thought and belief, even that also given the Article 19(1)(a), and it is not only confined to the speaking, it is not only confined to the words, it may be written, it may be visual, it may be any other mode, that is also to also considered under the Article 19(1). So here, up to here, we have to understand that Article 19(1)(a) is clearly talking, it is clearly enshrined in our Indian Constitution, that Article 19(1)(a) about the freedom of speech and expression, where almost all the citizens have to enjoy, because this is a fundamental rights, and fundamental right in the sense almost all the citizens have the right to enjoy these fundamental rights as enshrined by the Constitution, by the respective constitution. Similarly, in Indian Constitution, Article 19(1)(a) clearly talking about the freedom of speech and expression, and where it is, as I told you, it is not only confined to the words, it is not only confined to the writings, it may be any other mode of communication also. So it means Article 19 clearly given us as a fundamental right to speak freely, to share our opinion freely, so that so that the citizens of this country should enjoy this article, freedom of speech and expression. Friends, up to here, as I told you, first part I was talking about the evolution of the concept of the freedom of speech and expression, and the second part I was talking about the importance and the relevance, how it has recognized by various international agencies and organizations. Now I'm moving towards the meaning, implication and relevance of the concept of freedom of speech and expression. So friends, when we discuss with the experts, when we go into deeply regarding the concept of regarding its meaning, its implications, why it is necessary. So there are so many advantages, there are so many merits are available when we talk about the meaning and implications of freedom of speech and expression. And likewise, there are thousands relevance and importance, particularly in democratic form of government. So do we really need this concept in the democratic form of government? And really it has its own relevance and importance in the society, in the democratic form of government. Of course it has its own relevance, and of course it has its own importance. So before moving to regarding the relevance and importance of the concept, first we will see the meaning and implication of the concept of freedom of speech and expression. Freedom of speech and expression means freedom to communicate one's ideas, thought and expression through any means. Just now I told you that when we analyze the meaning of the concept of freedom of speech and expression, it is clearly talking about freedom to communicate one's ideas, thought, expression through any means, whether it is print, whether it is electronic, whether through our mouth, whatever it is the medium of communication. When we are enjoying and when we express our opinions, thought freely through any mode of communication, that is the meaning, that is the real cream of freedom of speech and expression. If how we will consider speaking freely without having any restriction? Because you must have seen, we have already observed that there are so many states, peoples, the individuals, the citizens, they are not allowed to speak freely against the government. That means the government has put some kind of restriction, not to open mouth, not to say against the rules and the regulation, how the government is running, what kind of steps taken by the government. Some states are there which are not allowed individual and citizens to speak freely. It means they are not able to enjoy the freedom of speech and expression freely. So when we talk about freedom of speech and expression, we have to understand that very clearly, that if the citizens, if the individuals are enjoying freedom to speak freely and express and communicate their ideas and thoughts of expression through any means, certainly we can say that that is the freedom of speech and expression. So the second important point here is clearly talking about, it is the liberty to speak openly without fear of government restraints. So how we will recognize, how we will point out that this is the freedom of speech and expression? If the government is not putting any kind of hurdles, any kind of hindrances, any kind of restriction, any kind of retribution, then it should be considered as a freedom of speech and expression. Just now I told you that when we consider freedom of speech and expression means government should not have any kind of restriction. If government puts some kind of restriction means the citizens, the individuals, they are not able to speak freely, means the citizens are not enjoying freedom of speech and expression. Without having any restriction, without having any lawsuit, if the individuals, if the citizens are able to speak freely about the government, about themselves, about the day-to-day activities of the government and political system, social and cultural activities of the government, then it should be considered as freedom of speech and expression. It means the government should not have any kind of restrictions. Of course, the government can have some kind of restriction, which we will discuss later part in the regional restriction. But in the preliminary stage, if we are going to discuss about the meaning and implication of the freedom of speech and expression, we have to understand up to here that if the government is not putting any kind of restriction, any kind of restraints, then it should be under the concept of the freedom of speech and expression. There should not be any hurdles, there should not be any hindrances, there should not be any restriction by the government side. And the third important point, that it speaks about the right to seek, receive, impart information either orally, written or through printed media. Just now while introducing, after the when I was giving little bit introduction about the freedom of speech and expression, I told you that how we will recognize and how it is not limited with the speech, how it is not limited with the mouth. When we talk about freedom of speech and expression means it also includes speaks about the right to seek. If we are seeking some kind of information from any other sources, that also can be considered under the category of freedom of speech and expression. It is not only seeking, but also receiving, but also imparting information, and at the same time it may be either orally, written or through printed material. If we are seeking, receiving and imparting information either in the form of written, either in the form of orally, or in the form of printed material, that is also considered as freedom of speech and expression. It means it is not only confined to the only words, it is not only confined to the written materials, and if we are seeking the information, if we are receiving the information from any other source, that is also can be considered as a freedom of speech and expression. Next, then when the fourth important point regarding the freedom of speech and expression is clearly talking about right to freedom of speech and expression also means, because different school of thought, different experts, different thoughts have given their meaning differently. Some people have also rightly argued that right to freedom of speech and expression also means freedom of publication. Freedom of publication also considered as the freedom of speech and expression. If the freedom of speech and expression given to an individual or citizen to speak about freely, to speak freely, naturally that is also, it goes without saying that the freedom of publication also involves in that freedom of speech and expression. The freedom of or right to speak also, it is there without saying it is quite understood. So it is also considered as a freedom of publication. So freedom of speech and expression does not confine within the words and mouth, but also it is talking about the freedom of publication. Then freedom of circulation. So the citizens, the individuals of the country, they can freely circulate their opinion after printing, or by give their opinion without having any restriction. So if the publication is made, if the independence or the freedom is not given for circulation, then again it will be having a little value. So freedom of speech and expression is not only confined to the written format, it is not only confined to the seeking, receiving and information, but at the same time freedom of publication also includes, freedom of circulation also involves inside it, and freedom to access all sources of information also it is there. So the third important point is here it is clearly mentioned that freedom to access all sources of information. As an individual, as a citizen, we are all enjoying the freedom of speech and expression, means it is not only confined to the freedom of publication, freedom of circulation, but also involves freedom to access all sources of information. Here I want to make one important point, that when we are talking about freedom of publication, freedom of circulation, freedom of access to all sources of information, the freedom of speech and expression also include to right to not to speak, right not to speak, or it means right to remain silent. That is also there inside this freedom of speech and expression, because if somebody is seeking information, it is the person concerned, I may give, I may not give. If the information is quite important, if the information, of course there is a act, that right to information act is there, but it also, my point of argument is that it also includes right to remain silent. This freedom of speech and expression also gives right to remain silent, or right not to speak. So it means slowly we are entering into different fields in different areas, that how the freedom of speech and expression spread like anything in the form of publication, in the form of circulation, in the form of accessing all sources of information. And that's why we must have seen almost all the media organization, they are running and by accessing the information through this freedom of speech and expression. And I would say that the journalists, the editors, the sub-editors, they enjoy this Article 19(1)(a) as a weapon, and for particularly freedom of publication, freedom of circulation, directly keeping in mind the media personals, the freedom of speech and expression is given its widespread area to enjoy the sub-editors to give a very good content on freedom of speech and expression in the papers, in the electronic media, on different medias. So point number 5 is talking about, it also gives right to the editor to decide what should be published and what should not be published. So no doubt, the citizens, the individuals, they enjoy the freedom of speech and expression. When you talk about the freedom of publication, freedom of printing, freedom of circulation, freedom to access all sources of information, it indirectly or directly gives freedom to the editors, what should be published, what should not be published. We cannot ask, we cannot raise any question why it has not been published, why it has published, because that person is enjoying his or her own freedom of speech and expression. It is up to him or up to her. So it means this freedom of speech and expression is given an ample right to these editors and sub-editors to what to publish and what not to publish. It is totally enjoyed by the editors and sub-editors. Now we'll come to the relevance of the concept of the freedom of speech and expression. Friends, when we talk about the freedom of speech and expression, its relevance, repeatedly I have told you that particularly in democratic form of government, it has a very good relevance. And if I am not mistaken, if you talk about the relevance, once the Thomas Jefferson, the former president of America, is given a choice, should have a government without press and press without government. Naturally, that Thomas Jefferson choose that I should have press first, then the government second. It means, you see, now they have considered, the Thomas Jefferson have considered that the press is more important than the government, because with the press, Thomas Jefferson was willing to run the government, and the government is secondary important, but the press is the first or primary important. Friends, some people have said that media is the fourth state of democracy, or the press is the fourth state of democracy. Why these experts, they have given such a big or huge comment? Because they consider that this concept has its own importance and relevance in the democratic or any of the other form of government. the concept of freedom of speech and expression, or the press or the media, talking about the fourth state of democracy. Friends, when you talk about the fourth state of democracy, naturally the other three great states like executive, legislature and judiciary, they are confined with their own activities. They are very much relevant to their own areas of activity, but it is the only one institution, that is freedom of speech and expression, that is the press, that is the media, who gives a little bit importance towards the publics, because since this executive, legislature and judiciary, they are confined to their own business, press is the only one medium who carries the message from the policy maker to the policy holder. It means the press is directly linked to the public, and whatever the message, whatever the information from the state government, from the central government, from the executive, from the legislature, from the judiciary, it is the only source, a reliable source of information, who carries the message from the policy maker to the policy holders. And when we talk about this policy maker to the policy holder, naturally the media is directly or indirectly little bit concerned about the public and the information or the dissemination of information. So it means it has a very good relevance in the democratic form of government, and likewise there are number of relevance are available. There are thousands of advantages are having when you talk about the relevance and importance of the press in democratic form of government or any other form of government. So the first one is that it helps in the democratic way of life. So friends, a free and fair press is always helping to the public, to this nation, because through the open discussion, through the sharing of information, through the debate, through the debate and discussion, the cream point come out, and the people are allowed to participate, to have their own opinion, and directly or indirectly it is clearly helping the democratic way of life, and the people have their own say to say, the people have their own right to speak, and the people have to raise their voice against the against which is not suitable to the people. And that's what talking about the relevance of the freedom of speech and expression, particularly in the democratic form of government. If the individuals, if the citizens are given full independence to speak, to participate in the debate, the social, economic and cultural debates when there is going on, whether it is a public press, whether it is a media debate, whatever it may, if the people are allowed to speak, allowed to enjoy their debate, naturally they can have their own words in front of the other people. That means they are directly or indirectly helping to use or to enjoy the democratic way of life. And the second important relevance is that it assists in the discovery of truth. When we participate in open discussion, when we debate ourselves in open discussion, naturally the truth, the cream will come out after huge debate, after long discussion. People will have their own say, people will put their own words, and by debating, by discussing all these their arguments, naturally the cream point and people or the individual citizen, they have to accept what exactly came out after the debate. It means while putting our opinion, while giving our suggestion, while sharing our opinions, naturally the peoples or the individuals, they will able to know what is wrong and what is right. They will recognize, they will identify which are necessary, which are not necessary. They will determine that really this is the truth and this is the false. So in that way it has its own relevance in the society. Point number third is talking about it strengthens the individual to participate in the decision making. Just now I told you that when we are enjoying the freedom of speech and expression, naturally it strengthens the individual to participate in the decision making process. So if whenever there is any new scheme, new projects are coming, sometimes people have raised their voice because that project, that scheme is not up to that mark, and who are going to get benefit and what is the percentage of benefits. These are the various arguments given by the individual, given by the citizens. So it means when we give our own thought, when we raise our own voice, it naturally strengthens the individuals to participate in the decision making, because decision is just such a unit, such an entity where almost all the feedback has collected, almost all the information, almost all the opinions were collected, then only the decision are being taken. So by the decision taken by the people's political leaders or the cabinet, whatever it may be, before that the people are given a huge chance to have their own words, to put their own opinion. That means they are enjoying the freedom of speech and expression to participate in the discussion and debate, and they are directly or indirectly playing a vital role for the decision making process. The point number 4, talking about all the members of the society able to communicate freely with others. When such kind of freedom of speech and expression is given, irrespective of caste, creed, color, power, position, and designation, people naturally communicate within the society without any restriction, without any retribution by the government. Naturally, all the members of the society can communicate freely. If we compare this kind of freedom of speech and expression in any other where the people are not able to speak freely, then that kind of society is not able to communicate properly. If the societal members are communicating properly and enjoying the freedom to speak openly, and they have give their own opinion, and they can share, they can disseminate, they can share their information within the society, naturally that will really helpful for the growth and development of the society. It means all the members of the society, by this freedom of speech and expression, all the members of the society, they will be able to communicate freely without having any restrictions. If the members of the society are communicating freely, naturally they are enjoying the freedom of speech and expression, and that kind of society, that type of society really considered having a full relevance of freedom of speech and expression, because the societal members, they have such kind of independence where they can communicate their ideas, thought and opinions freely without having any restriction. So point number 5, it helps the individual to attain self-sufficiency. That is also very much important, and it is one of the important relevance of the society, that by giving this kind of freedom of speech and expression where the individual can have their self-sufficient, by giving his own opinion, by taking others' opinions and view, the individual know what to do, what not to do, whether I will accept it or whether I will discard it. So by taking opinions and sharing his own opinions directly or indirectly, it helps a lot to have the self-sufficient to the individuals. So these are 5 important points talking about the relevance of the freedom of speech and expression. Now we will move to what are the reasonable restrictions. Friends, when we talk about any law, any silent features of the Indian Constitution or any other countries, naturally it is a great all the concepts, all the rights given in one hand and taken by another hand. Similarly, in our Indian Constitution also, some people have rightly said that Indian Constitution given in one hand and taken by another hand. The thing is, or the significance or the philosophy behind that, whatever the rights, fundamental rights we are enjoying, at the same time we are having some reasonable restriction. Friends, when we are talking about the enjoying of fundamental rights, at the same time we should have the fundamental duty. We should perform our fundamental duties also. The fundamental rights and fundamental duties go simultaneously.